So today's webinar is about the war in Ukraine and about the current situation that we are at and where is it going. And for this purpose, we brought in Keir Giles, one of the top experts in the world for Russia and one of the people who are following very closely the current situation in Ukraine. Keir is a senior consultant in one of the top programs at Chatham House, where it basically looks at Eurasia and Russia as well as other prestigious roles that he has. And for many years, he has been not only working on the topic, but also working with Wikistrat. So I can personally testify that I've been enjoying his insights. So, Keir, thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated. And at this point, I want to start by actually passing the ball to you to a kind of a short introduction to the topic and the insights that you want to address and begin with.
Great. Thanks very much, Oren. And just before I start, thanks for specifying that this is held under the Chatham House rule. For the record, everything I say is always on the record. So by all means, however you treat whatever the people are saying, it is okay to quote me because I take responsibility for everything I say. And speaking of which, I was happy to see the title for this session, talking about a new phase in the war on Ukraine, but then adding a question mark, because I think it is a fair question, but I think, no, it is not really correct to say that the war is entering a new phase, despite all of the exciting media headlines that we've had about Russia's war on Ukraine over the past few weeks. It may look like news, but I think everything that is happening is just the continuation of trends that have been set for months, if not for years. And we see that in all of the different fields and areas within which this war is being fought. For example, the front line, where Russia continues to grind forward at the cost of immense casualties and very slow rates, 950 square kilometers captured from Ukraine in the last 2 months at the cost of Lord knows how many casualties, because Russia's never going to tell us the truth. That may have faded from the news slightly, faded from the mainstream media, because there's no major focal points. There's no major battle for a recognizable town in the same way as there was, for example, for Bakhmut or Avdiivka. And let's not forget, at each of those battle points, this was supposed to be a pivotal moment for the front line as a whole. Instead, we've got slow encroachment across a much broader area, which doesn't make quite such an exciting story for people to focus on. And so, as happens so often, the war in Ukraine seems to fade away in the face of so many other pressing issues around the world that are competing for global attention. But it's very much still an ongoing, very literal battle of attrition. Ukraine exacting as great a cost as it can as it falls back as the best and most immediate means of causing damage to Russia and hoping to outlast Russia. But of course, at the same time, Ukraine suffering that devastating cost to its own people as the price of survival. And that's led to each side, of course, looking for other means of gaining advantage or causing the opposition harm. Russia seems to have stepped away from the infrastructure campaigns that were waged in order to try to make Ukraine stop functioning as a state earlier on in the conflict, and instead it is simply the terror bombing of Ukrainian cities, stepping up the drone bombardments in much greater numbers. But that too, a trend that we identified earlier. There were forecasts for how many drones Russia would be able to turn out using its new plants in Tatarstan, and that indeed has fed through into what's happening on the front lines and in these constant bombardments. That seems to have more than compensated for the damage that was done to Russia's bomber fleet at the beginning of June in Operation Spiderweb. That too, apparently a standout moment, but continuing the trend of Ukrainian innovation and finding new means of taking the fight into Russia, which is absolutely essential for Ukraine to do. Over the last week, we've heard headlines about the Russian economy potentially going into meltdown, but again, exactly as forecasted. All of these dire predictions from the central bank, all of the headline numbers that show the Russian economy going down the toilet are what experts told us roughly this time last year would be happening by late 2025 or potentially early 2026. The forecasts that Russia would run out of time because it would run out of manpower or materiel or economy. But, of course, that doesn't matter if Russia simply doesn't care and does not treat economic survival or even the avoidance of long-term damage to the economy as something which is a counterweight to its ambition for crushing Ukraine. So they may be destroying their own country, but it doesn't seem to matter in terms of decision-making. And partly, of course, Russia has been rescued from these forecasts of running out of time by its backers, by North Korea providing the manpower, by China providing support in a number of different ways, by Donald Trump repeatedly offering to freeze the conflict at a time when Russia feels it could be advantageous, and clearly Putin can't accept that at any time when Russia considers that actually it isn't better to press on and they should pocket their wins and wait for another time to push forward further. And even this latest news, the US suspension of supplies of weapon systems to Ukraine, the only surprise is that it took them so long. It's clear that the war was never going to be decided on the front lines or even in Ukraine itself, but it was going to be the coalitions of backers and how committed they were to each of their respective sides, Ukraine or Russia, that was going to make all the difference. And the United States administration stated very clearly, even before coming to power, what its attitude to this was going to be. So less support for Ukraine, but almost simultaneously with this news of US curtailment of weapons shipments, news of an increase in North Korea's support in terms of manpower to Russia. So you see this disbalance between these two coalitions, one of which is firmly on side and providing what their person in the ring needs when they need it, and the other which has had the rug pulled from under it by one of the least reluctant supporters, previously the United States, actually now curtailing its aid and attempting to enforce the terms of surrender dictated by Moscow onto the victim of Russian aggression. None of this, too, should have come as a surprise. Ukraine, Europe, everybody else that is backing Ukraine ought to have been fully prepared for this because it was declared so long in advance. But still, the slow pace of change in Europe argues that the urgency of preparing for Russia's next move after Ukraine, after whatever kind of settlement ends the major combat operations in Ukraine, still hasn't been realized across Europe. You have a perverse situation here in the UK at the moment where there are plans for defence, a strategic defence review in the UK, which is a good plan, but without any funding allocated to it. Meanwhile, in NATO, you have the opposite. You have a promise of 5% of GDP funding, but no plan on actually how to spend it. So it's still the frontline states which are matching those two together, recognizing the urgency of doing something and actually finding the funding to do it. But west of Warsaw, they're still operating on a peacetime footing and thinking that all of this is a problem for tomorrow. And that's something else that really hasn't changed since day one of this war or even before it. Ukraine has bought and is still buying time for Europe with the lives of its citizens and with its economy, but that time has largely been squandered. So the situation now is much worse than if action had been taken early, and it continues to get worse. So I would argue that this is not a new phase that we see in the war, in Russia's war on Ukraine, despite the surprises that continue to be pulled out of the hat, particularly by Ukraine. Instead, we know precisely what the direction of the war is. We know how it could be changed, but our political leaders, by and large, are unwilling to take the necessary steps. Thanks very much. I'm greatly looking forward to discussing.
Thank you, Keir. And I think the first question is not so much about the developments in the battlefield, but the diplomatic ones. We saw great pressure by the new administration led by Trump on Zelensky to essentially to convey to a deal. A lot of it was also a kind of a negotiation strategy to show Putin that there are potentially the ability to negotiate with the United States as a mediator, and kind of complying to a Russian narrative in a sense. But at the end of the day, we don't really understand what happened afterwards. Where is this going, the diplomatic effort? Is there any advancements? Are there any changes? Are the Russians willing to compromise? Maybe you can shed some light about the diplomatic situation currently that we're seeing.
I think it's a little flattering to call what the US administration was doing a negotiating strategy, basically accepting all of what Russia wanted and then trying to present that as a package to Ukraine. There's a lot of misleading language that's been used about that. The phrase peace talks was ongoing for a long time when no such thing was happening. There were two parallel tracks. Russia talking to the United States and the United States then passing on the demands from Moscow, and separately, Ukraine talking with its backers about what, in fact, might be feasible. And it's only at a very late stage that those came together with direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, and we've seen how little they've actually achieved because there is no common ground that can be reached between Russia that wants to destroy Ukraine and Ukraine that wants to survive. So that's the hard realization that perhaps the US administration has belatedly come to, which is why we hear so much less now about these so-called peace initiatives, because it has turned out to be a bit more difficult to impose Russia's terms on Ukraine than President Trump had perhaps initially imagined. No doubt it will come back again, but I think some of the elements of the potential routes to an end to a conflict or to greater support for Ukraine, like the so-called minerals deal, and again, misleading terminology, the minerals mugging, we should call it really, from the United States extorting as much as possible from Ukraine, has come to nothing. It hasn't led to any of the guarantees on either side that it was actually intended to. So, as long as when the United States says it's going to pull away from this peace process, it just means stopping trying to impose Russia's terms and not actually stopping support for Ukraine altogether, this is a positive outcome. But more and more disturbingly, it looks as though it is simply abandoning Ukraine to Russia.
What would you say are the Russians' objectives as of today? Are they back into, because of Trump's election, are they back into the same objectives that they had in 2022 on the eve of the invasion, or something have changed and they're willing to compromise? So where do we see the Russian have changed or not their objectives from this war?
Well, there's no indication at the moment that Russia is in any mood to compromise, and that's partly related to the previous question. Why are they not leaping at the chance that has been presented to them to freeze the conflict as it is at the moment? Because rightly or wrongly, in the Kremlin, they've concluded that it is better to fight on and to push on suffering these enormous casualties than to take the peace deal that is on offer. Now, that calculus may at some point change. If Russia does decide it cannot sustain its current effort, then of course it will be willing to take what is offered from the United States. But for now, the Russian calculus seems very much to say that yes, continuing to push forward in Ukraine by military means is going to bring the best outcome. In the longer term, of course, the overall objective won't have changed, and it's the objective that Putin set when he spoke to the Russian people on the evening before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, saying that what he wanted to do was correct the historic strategic mistakes of 100 years ago, when, as part of the setting up of the USSR, the lines on the map that are closely approximating what we see today were laid down as the national republics of the USSR. That, he says, needs to be corrected, to be erased. In other words, anybody that thinks that Ukraine is going to be the only victim of this Russian campaign thinks that all of the other former countries of the Russian Empire somehow get a special pass.
One of the questions I asked you before, I'm going to ask it again because maybe it changed. How much is this Putin's war versus Russia's war?
That's a conversation which, fortunately, we have to have a lot less frequently than when you and I first started discussing this years ago, Aaron. It used to be that we would have to lay the groundwork for conversations like this by establishing, first of all, that Putin is not inventing this stuff. It's not him dragging a reluctant Russia along behind him. He's actually tapping into some very deep-seated beliefs about Russia's rights and Russia's place in the world among not only the ruling elite around him, but broad sectors of Russian society as well. Now, that we don't have to argue quite as hard these days because it has become so very clear to people observing Russian societal behavior in war, what Russians abroad are doing, that they are, by and large, fully on board with this war and urging their soldiery on to more and better genocide in Ukraine. So that leads on to the other question that another one that we habitually used to be asked in the days before this: what happens when Putin goes? Is there going to be a change in direction? Will there be somebody that has a different idea of how Russia should behave? The answer, sadly, is almost certainly not.
From a perspective of looking at the Ukrainian side, we know that within Ukraine, the political situation is also about not 100% sure about following Zelensky and in his leadership. and there were voices about maybe changing direction. How effective would that be in terms of ending the war, or it wouldn't really matter much who is leading Ukraine as long as they're not basically articulate to the conditions that the Russians are forcing them to take?
I think you have a mirror image situation in Ukraine, where if you had a leader that through some mechanism replaced Zelensky that actually wanted to sue for peace and surrender, they would be just as unpopular as if Zelensky were to do the same now. Let's not forget that when Zelensky was first elected, part of his ticket, part of his manifesto was looking for a way out of the conflict with Russia, looking to actually resolve all of this. So it's been a U-turn that's been forced on him by Putin. But along with that, this consolidation of Ukrainian society behind survival, encouraged, of course, by the recognition of what happens if you do surrender to Russian domination. Everybody has seen the misery that's being imposed by this savage military occupation in the temporarily occupied territories. Everybody sees what happens when Russia withdraws from territory that it has been in control of. And that, of course, has galvanized resistance within Ukraine because survival is absolutely essential if you are not to suffer that fate.
One of the questions we received from the audience before was about where is the center of gravity for this conflict for Ukraine and for Russia? Meaning, we talked a lot about the manpower limitations. It seems that there is no more prisoners in Russian jails. I mean, they kind of empty out whatever they could. But the idea was if they ran out of X, i.e., tanks, before it was like mortar shells, now it's about manpower. The war will be short, and you mentioned the economy. That again, people were predicting X and Y happened. So where is the center of gravity for Russia? Where is the center of gravity for Ukraine? Because currently it seems that both of them are locking this war of attrition without really an exit or a potential win or a loss, just basically a continuation in order not to be defeated.
Yes, you can point to any number of things without which it would be exceptionally difficult to continue the war and survive. And as you hinted just now, those things change over time because with the evolving nature of this conflict, there have been different capabilities that have come to the fore at different moments. Now, where we are at the moment, of course, this reduction in the amount of air defense munitions that is being supplied to Ukraine is going to have an immediately damaging effect because of this sustained and high intensity air campaign against Ukrainian cities. But I still think that what neither country can afford to run out of in strategic terms over the whole duration of the conflict is support from its backers. Because I still think that it is not within Ukraine itself that the conflict is going to be decided. It is how much and to what extent those backers are willing to actually stake their own futures on what happens in Ukraine. Far more of an existential threat to Europe than it is to the United States or indeed to Russia. But Europe seems to be very slow to recognize that fact.
And if Russia is basically going to be looking at concluding the war, what would push it to do so? From which perspective? Because the Ukrainian have tried, like I said, with the spiderweb operation to show that they have the ability to penetrate the back lines of Ukraine, of the Russians defend with the invasion of Kursk, in order to show that they can basically take Russian territory and bring the war to Russia, which ultimately did not succeed. So the question is, what will be the point that the Russians will look at the war and say, okay, we have to give up at this point because this is going to have a very high level of political cost. You mentioned the backers, but are there other aspects to it that the Russians are looking at and are concerned about?
Well, certainly this campaign to bring the war to Russians is absolutely vital for Ukraine. And in fact, it was identified as such quite a long time ago, early in the war, by then General Zaluzhny, writing about exactly where the center of gravity for this conflict was going to be. He identified we have to make ordinary Russians understand that they are involved, that this is not something which happens to other people a long way away, but that's actually going to affect them directly. Problem with that, of course, is that Russia is a very large place, and Russia is exceptionally skilled and practiced at concealing what's actually going on within the country from its own population, and sometimes, of course, from its own leadership as well. So a key part of this question is how much of the real state of Russia's economy, of its future, of its manpower, of its military capability is reaching the people that make the decisions, and of course, primarily Putin, who, if we are to believe those people that say they have special insights into how Putin's court works, doesn't like to be brought bad news. So it is not just the objective assessment of how bad the damage to Russia it has to be in order to bring about a situation where it doesn't profit them to continue the war. It's also convincing the leadership as well that things are going to get so bad for them personally rather than for the country that it is time to change course. But then, of course, it may not matter because they are still being offered the opportunity by the United States to seize and to freeze the conflict and to make sure that at the point where it becomes too dangerous for them, they can be rescued from the effects of their own misadventures by holding out their hand to the United States and saying, yes, okay, let's stop now.
When you're talking about Ukraine and the center of gravity, you're talking about the support of the allies. And obviously, with the United States, the situation there is not only tricky, but obviously went south with the election of Trump. Where do you see this with the European allies? You said there, it doesn't seem like the sense of urgency as if it was when Trump was basically going and changing the direction. It seems like there was some sort of a change there in the speed of the moves. They're not really as much as with the urgency, and we honestly don't see much going on from the European side that could be replacing the United States or offering some sort of an alternative. So, where are the Europeans, specifically those countries such as France or the UK, for example, are when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Again, it's something where you still have exactly the same situation now as you did in the very early stages of the war, just a slightly different degree, but still this gradient of security, this gradient of understanding of what is happening and what it means for people's lives that runs from east to west. The frontline states, which understand very clearly that their own futures are at stake and therefore they have to invest in crash rearmament, in societal resilience, in all of the things that make them hard targets for Russia. And then the European hinterland, which still thinks that it is at peace and is making plans for decade or multi-decade periods, while at the same time recognizing that the forecast for when Russia might be ready to move against a NATO state is measured in years or in some cases even months. So that mismatch of timescales, that mismatch between saying, well, if we find the money, we might be ready by 2035, and at the same time saying, yes, looks like Russia might be ready to move by 2027, just shows how much of a cognitive gap there is in these countries between understanding and internalizing that Russia is a problem and actually realizing that you have to do something about it. And yes, there are all kinds of reasons why it is hard for political leaders to accept this. The fact that it is going to be painful to find the money to do it. The fact that they are going to have to explain to their populations and their voters that their lives are going to have to change as a result of a threat which has been played down to them for decades. The fact that they have to come clean and admit that their own armed forces have been so hollowed out by decades of cuts that they're no longer capable of fulfilling the mission that they were actually designed for. All of these are really difficult political things, but most politicians west of Warsaw are really now running out of excuses for not gripping this problem.
Is there a potential situation in which we see an interference of one of those other countries? And I'm talking on both sides. So we saw North Korea sending troops to the front line as part of a defense package. So can we see something like this happening with a European country helping Ukraine in some sort of a situation or a scenario? Even a NATO alliance member that basically gets involved, but not the whole NATO alliance, or on the other hand, slash China getting involved and providing Russia with not only economic support and materialistic support, but something a little bit more tangible in the sense of sending troops or something like that. Do you see any situation that such an escalation could take place?
Sadly, I think it is surprising that we have not yet seen more support from Russia's backers, and it is far more likely than we will see the similar kind of support from Ukraine's backers. I was expecting that by this point we might see some more concrete and visible contribution by China to Russia's war efforts, such as, for example, providing combat equipment. I think it is far less likely that the so-called coalition of the willing of Western countries is ever going to get off the ground and actually provide something which is tangible to Ukraine in the way that they were predicting and forecasting so very confidently back in March. And the reason, of course, is not just the extent of capabilities, but the extent of political will. We had a brief period when the so-called reassurance force for Ukraine was announced with great enthusiasm when Britain and France thought that they were going to co-lead this force. And then, very, very short period afterwards, you had British Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying, well, actually, no, we can't do this at all without the Americans, who had already said, obviously, that they were not planning on backing this venture at all. So I think it has been an injection of reality in terms of what can, in fact, be achieved by what is left of European armed forces. And that is going to place very, very strict limits on what they think they can do for Ukraine without having the United States firmly on side. Meanwhile, no such restrictions on Iran, North Korea, China, because they don't see the downsides and the costs from continuing their cooperation with Russia.
Do we see any situation that is evolving that on the technological side of things that could tell us that maybe there is a change in the war in terms of the level of attrition to a war that is more dynamic? I mean, we have been seeing a lot about the drones, the Ukrainian use of small drones, tactical drones, the Russians using the Iranian slash their own production drones in order to bomb the cities with the rockets. So we do see some elevation of the use of technologies, not so much in the technology, I would say the advance or the level of high quality and the high quality of the technology, but more about the scale that we're seeing much more use of it than before. It was very minimal, and now it's very largely used and scaled down, like in the case of the drones, um, or any type of that kind of a technology that we see that is impacting the battlefield in a way that could lead to some change in the way the war is being fought right now.
Well, I think we've seen that already, looking at the way that the war has evolved over time from its very early stages. In fact, in all three, yeah, more than three, in all domains, we've seen a transformation and a very rapid one in terms of how both of these sides are fighting. The infantry fight is unrecognizable from the early stages. The air war, what's happening at sea with the Black Sea Fleet essentially being cleared by Ukraine with use of new technologies. All of these speak to this very rapid pressure cooker environment where war is forcing technological evolution and a technological arms race at a pace which is far, far more rapid than Western countries are managing to keep up with or even to track. All of this, I think, speaks to not only the transformational effect of technology overall, but even within each of those technological subsets, within, for example, drones, the way they, as an individual technology, have evolved so that they are unrecognizable from what we took for granted just 3 years ago. All speaks to how vital it is for Western countries to draw the right lessons from what is happening there and not the wrong ones. We will inevitably have the same old ongoing debates about the role of manned fighter aircraft, the role of main battle tanks, despite everything that we have seen, or rather, yeah, informed by everything that we've seen in Ukraine, we'll still have those arguments within Western militaries that are either determined to get rid of those technologies because they're expensive or wedded to them because there are so many sunk costs involved in them. And it is going to be a controversy that will roll on until and there is a major conflict which involves one of those countries fighting the war that it thought it was going to fight against Russia, which may be approaching the conflict in a very different way. Which is a roundabout way of saying that there are lots of lessons observed from the way in which technology has changed warfare within Russia. And the vital task for Western militaries is to place the right bet and adopt the right ones for when their own turn comes to confront Russia.
So it's been more or less almost a year since the Prigozhin revolt. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. I'm probably butchering it, but the head of Wagner basically marched to Moscow. I'm not sure how to call it a demonstration, a manifestation of discontent, power dynamics gone wrong, whatever you want to call it. We saw that happening last year. And it kind of came out of the blue in the sense of the action that it took, but not the dynamics of the fight themselves, the internal dynamics within those within those involved in the war in Russia, that basically you could see that there were like different power groups, the Ministry of Defense and Shogun versus the Wagner Group and so on. Do we see anything like that kind of emerging again in Russia? Do we see anything like that again, kind of bubbling, or basically Putin actually got his house in order, and there's only one and one only kind of Ministry of Defense and one only state-powered war in this case?
I had to quickly pinch myself and check because I was sure that it was 2 years since the Prigozhin mutiny. And yes, I think that was 2023, which is just a sign of how rapidly time is moving as we're watching this war. Yes, it has been quite a long time since that happened. And no, it hasn't been repeated, but then we weren't expecting it to because Prigozhin was an outlier. He was a one-off in a very specific manner. He was somebody that was outside that stable pyramid of power within Russia, but nevertheless had been allowed to accumulate a power source of his own. He was one of the, or rather, he was the person that had a private army, but wasn't actually locked into that leadership structure where of mutual obligation and of everybody being invested in the system remaining stable. So he was an outside disruptor and so a strategic mistake by the regime to allow him to develop as such. I can't see that mistake being repeated in any way in the future. Because everybody else that has similar means of exerting power against the regime, if they chose to, is actually bound so tightly into the regime that it makes no sense because they'll bring down the system that keeps them alive, healthy, and incredibly rich.
So we can say that today, basically, the situation in Russia internally is much more stable. That the current decision making is much more top to bottom without having to deal with pockets of resistance. It's the level of discipline is higher. So in a way, that it seems that the opposition to the war, rather being coming from nationalists who don't think that Putin is taking an aggressive enough stand, or from those who are Moldovs who think maybe the war should be concluded in order to end it. It seems that there's no such opposition anymore in any way or form. Would that be a correct statement in a sense?
Even the people that are urging Russia on to do more, faster, harder, and worse seem to have gone a little bit quiet. And those people that were opposed to the war have either voted with their feet and left the country, or understand that it's a very unhealthy life choice to actually voice that opposition at the moment. So, from on the face of it, yes, you have a much more homogenous body of support within Russia for the war itself. Now, that, of course, we have to caveat with the fact that, as ever, there's quite limited visibility into what exactly people within Russia really think, but there's certainly less evidence discernible from the outside of any kind of doubt being sown in the widespread popular support for the war. And let's not forget there are some pretty good reasons why that support is still strong, particularly when it comes to the transformational effect of the pitchfork loads of cash that have been thrown at recruitment and the way in which the traditionally disadvantaged parts of the country, the remote bits of Russia where life had never really reached the 20th century, let alone the 21st, suddenly finding that they have enormous infusions of money and things are changing very rapidly for the better, while in the cities, things are maybe a little bit tighter, but definitely not very much worse. So overall, there's this rising tide which is floating all the boats in Russia, and a lot of people have reason to be actually quite grateful for the war.
That led me to one of the points that I wanted to discuss. I've spoke to some Russia experts, and they say one of the biggest things that happened was that because of the sanctions on Russian nationals to take money out of Russia, a lot of the money basically got locked slash returned to Russia, so it won't be seized. So that created an economic boom that is actually a healthy, so to speak, economic boom. I.e., the trade may not be open, but before it was open, but went to the pockets of just a few. Now, basically, that money is kind of trickling down the economic ladder. That more layers of the society are enjoying it, from production to services and so on, just because the money is not leaving the country anymore. So, from that perspective, how economically is the war beneficial for those in Russia right now that are actually gaining from it. Like, how painful, in another way to ask it, how painful is the war economically to the average Russians or to Russians in general?
Yeah, let me be very clear. I'm not an economist, so when talking about this kind of stuff, I rely on those people that are economists that I trust because they've generally turned out to be right. And what they seem to be more or less agreed on is that despite the fact that the long-term permanent damage to the Russian economy is going to be disastrous, for the time being, the bubble has not burst, and so the increase in incomes and therefore in standard of living that you've described is actually still at the moment pretty beneficial for most Russians. But then, as I mentioned in the introduction earlier on, you've heard these alarm bells now being rung louder and louder by people within the Russian system, where you could assume it takes a certain amount of courage to speak out about the way national policy is going badly wrong, but nevertheless feel they have to speak up and say, look, all of these economic indicators show how badly the war is deforming the economy and how it will actually cause irreversible damage. So it's a question of time, just as the war is a question of time, just as the survival of Russia as a whole is a question of time. But for the time being, these economists assure me, if Russia is bailed out, continues to be bailed out by its supporters around the world in the way that it has been up until now, there's not going to be the immediate crash and immediate destruction of the Russian economy that some of their more optimistic or pessimistic colleagues have been predicting for decades now already.
One of the questions that we've been asked a lot at Wikistrat was, what if the war continues not for another year or two, but to a period of a decade or more? In other words, the war of a week that was supposed to take place for 1 week, as Putin kind of expected it to be a quick decapitation of the regime in Ukraine in order to take over the country within a week, basically collapse into a war that is attrition that takes more than a decade. What would be the implications of such a scenario if that really the case? Because it looks like we are stuck in this situation with no end in sight at this moment.
Hmm. One of the really interesting effects of the war has been on the power dynamic between Russia and China, and the way it has accelerated that relative shift in which of them is more powerful. There was already the trend where China obviously was growing stronger, Russia is growing weaker, and this was anticipated after a certain period of time to lead to a situation where China could effectively demand things from Russia without necessarily needing to count the cost, such as, for example, energy concessions, such as Northern Sea Route access. All of that we thought was going to be about 10, 15 years down the track. All of it has happened already because Russia is transforming itself faster and faster into a client state of China on which demands can be put. So if the war were to continue for a decade, and if that acceleration were to continue, it could potentially bring about all of the things that we've been thinking about in the much longer term, in terms of Russia ending up being a very, very different country because of all of the systemic strategic challenges about which the Russian leadership have been consistently in denial. And that's the relationship with China. It is the not so much the failure, but the refusal to reform the economy when they had the opportunity. It's the excuse me, the demographic challenge, the long-term one, this demographic black hole feeding through the workforce now, and of course being massively exacerbated by casualties in Ukraine and also by the emigration of those who don't want to become casualties in Ukraine. Every State of the Nation speech Putin gives at the moment, he's boasting about how low Russia's unemployment rate is, but not actually mentioning the reason why they're losing employable people at an enormous rate. So put all of that together, and excuse me, we were always expecting that, say, 20 to 30 years down the track, we'd be looking at a very different country, possibly politically, possibly socially, possibly even geographically. The war is bringing that point closer in so many different ways.
That's fascinating. So essentially, we're going to be looking at 2032, a decade into the war, or 2035, if we want to round it out 10 years from now, into a Russia that is going to be not only weakened internally by this crisis, by this war, but a Russia that is going to be essentially on the geopolitical map going to have to make some sort of concession either to the West, so to speak, or to China, but it's no longer going to be an independent actor on the geopolitical map. Would that be correct to say?
Certainly won't be independent in the way that Russia has considered itself independent. As a sovereign nation that does not need alliances, that does not need partners, can actually act independently. And this is one of the things that has been somehow massaged into the Russian military psyche, whereas previously there was the mythology, the mythos within the Russian officer corps, for example, that the Russian military is entirely self-sufficient, and it may have vassals, it may have auxiliaries, but it doesn't depend on help from anywhere outside. And then here come the North Koreans riding to the rescue. How exactly that has been squared with the Russian military idea of itself is going to be a really fascinating thing to discover when we do finally get the opportunity to do so. But all of it together, yes, it means that the Russia that we know at the moment is not going to survive that long. But let's not lose sight of the biggest problem that's involved in this. We're talking another 7 years down the track. We've got to survive that long while Russia is still continuing to wreak untold misery, not just about Ukraine, but really everywhere it can reach.
You mentioned that a little bit, the reach out of Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also other way. And we saw in some places that we see that this has become a little bit of a global conflict with Ukrainian units operating in Africa, even in Syria. Part of the Assad regime collapse. We heard that Ukrainian units have trained some of the Syrian rebellions that later took over with drone warfare and so on. So we see that the Ukraine is actually doing something that I don't think anybody anticipated, which is to take the war outside of the front lines of Ukraine, Russia, also to the international level, specifically where Russia is operating, i.e., Middle East and Africa. Do you see this trend expanding or continuing and kind of escalating, or do you see this trend kind of weakening as the war and the attrition kind of bear the cost of expanding it, and you have to kind of consolidate your efforts in?
Well, yes, Ukraine's done a great many things that have taken people by surprise throughout the course of this war. But I don't think that we're going to see an end to this being internationalized. And I don't think anybody can continue to say that this is just a European problem, let alone just a Ukrainian problem, when it is in fact Asian powers that are also involved in the invasion of Europe. It is very much already a global conflict between those countries which, despite their separate objectives, see it as essential to overturn the rules-based international order and reduce the power of Western liberal democracies and what remains of those Western liberal democracies, faced with the onslaught now from all of these different countries around the world that have these shared objectives. And of course, pivotal to all of that is the role of the United States, with an administration that no longer aspires to be the leader of the free world, instead aspires to be the kind of leader that the free world used to unite against. So what that calls for is a global coalition of those countries that do still place value in the rules-based international order that for the last decades has kept them relatively prosperous, reasonably secure, instead of the alternative, which is very, very much more dangerous.
Much of the insights that we are having here through the discussion are probably not new to those in Russia that are part of the security apparatus or part of the governing mechanism of the regime, and yet you do not see them basically doing anything. And specifically, I want to ask about how they view China. It seems that they're in a desperate place that they will take whatever help comes from whoever is giving them, but when you do that with someone like China, and historically Russia looked at China as not as a competitor but as a potential rival, even a conflicting one. Where do you see those relations going? Knowing that within Russia they are aware that they're being exploited, they are aware that there is a level of here that it's not China is supporting Russia because of an ideological or something like that. It's primarily because of their own benefit. Are we likely to see some sort of and we know Trump is really wants to push Russia to their side, like a Nixon in reverse, and sort of a Nixon visit to Beijing, a Trump visit to Moscow, kind of a thing, and bring Russia into their fold. Do we see some potential clash between the two countries, or kind of a rip between the two countries coming in at some moment in the near future, in your opinion?
I don't see a rift. And the reason is because Russia has staked its future on this war for which it needs China. And for China, it's also a particularly comfortable situation because it has its two major adversaries in the world biting chunks out of each other and can sit back and wait until Russia collapses and picks up the pieces, if you want to massively oversimplify the history of the next 30 years. I've no doubt that there is no shortage of people within Moscow who understand just exactly how deadly for the future of Russia this dependent relationship is in order to prosecute this war. But you still have the hangover from decades within Russia, within the security culture, within the production of Russia's national documentation, their strategies, their doctrines, and so on, where you could not mention China as a threat, where it was a taboo subject. You simply did not admit the existence of China as a problem, and of course lays the groundwork for all of the declarations of partnership without limit, based on the recognition that if you do treat China as an adversary or as a rival, that is immediate political and diplomatic and economic pain. Whereas if you focus all of your bile and anger westwards and beat NATO and the West with a rhetorical stick, you can do that all day without any comeback. So they're still dealing with a situation where the self-induced omerta about the future of the relationship with China constrains what can actually be said. And of course, the longer that continues, the worse it's going to get.
A question we received from the crowd, and it actually connects to some of the activities we have done before, and that is, would Putin and Russia consider the use of some sort of a nuclear weapon in the conflict against Ukraine, considering the threat level that they're being mentioning every once in a while about the potential use or the fact that they have the weapons as kind of a threat? What do you think about that?
Well, sadly, nuclear weapons have already been used to enormous effect by Russia, but not as things that go bang. They've been used as information weapons. They've been used as an extremely successful tool to shape the policy of the United States under the Biden administration, with very, very little likelihood, close to zero likelihood, that they would ever actually be used for their original intended purpose, because there aren't any circumstances under which that would make Russia's situation better, not worse. But they won't have to use them because they've been so effective in this secondary role, just as a big stick to intimidate the United States into not supporting Ukraine, because they have led the United States to the conclusion that it is more dangerous to allow Russia to suffer a defeat than it is to allow a neighbor of Russia's to be destroyed, which of course has immediate implications not just for Ukraine, but also for any other neighbor of Russia that might suffer an attack from Moscow, whether or not it's a member of NATO. Now, if what I've said takes anybody that's listening in by surprise, as so often with these things, we've written this down at enormous length, and it's actually one of the links that has already been posted in the chat there. The study put out by Chatham House as long ago as mid-2023 called Russian Nuclear Intimidation. And I think the subtitle goes something like, "And How It Shapes Western Policy." That's about 40,000 words of explaining how we reached the conclusion that I just described to you, and it's a free download.
One of the things we see sometimes in situation of conflict like this is that the conflict spills over to neighboring states, not necessarily the ones you would predict, but states that are in some fragile position. Do you see Russia at some point actually kind of taking a move against another state in what they call the near abroad, those former USSR countries, using the war in Ukraine as a pretext, or using the war in Ukraine as kind of a situation that they're already in war, so let's get involved in another situation, and which they have done before in other cases. Do you see Russia basically basically expanding the war from Ukraine to any one of the other countries that they've been looking into and have a conflict with?
Well, that may not necessarily be the rationale for Russia making a move against another country in Europe. In fact, there's a strong argument that Russia's energies are so consumed with the fighting in Ukraine that they're not in a fit state to actually do anything like that elsewhere. So it's only if major combat operations in Ukraine come to an end with some form of ceasefire that the brakes are off and the clock is ticking for a Russian move elsewhere. And then, of course, the perpetual conversation that keeps coming back to people like me is where next for Russia? And the usual candidates are put forward again and again, the Baltic states, Poland, possibly even Finland. But the truth is, I think it is a constantly shifting equation. And there's no one single answer because the answer moves over time, not just as a result of Russia's own military strengths, which primarily, of course, now we're talking about the strengths to deliver damage at enormously long distances through the Air Force, the Navy, cyber proxies, etc., but also because of the return on investment. What would Russia actually achieve by mounting an assault? And we've had lots of scenarios for how Russia could challenge NATO by moving against the Baltic states and saying, well, NATO, come and get me. But the reality is that all of those frontline states have made themselves hard targets in anticipation of precisely that kind of Russian move. And there's still the European hinterland, which might be more politically productive and produce greater political leverage on an organization like NATO, but which is far worse prepared for dealing with Russia actually doing something like that. Now we have countries like France, like Germany, like the United Kingdom that are saying, well, we are far away from the conflict. We're insulated from it because we have the whole of Eastern Europe between where the fighting is and us. And the unfortunate fact is they're looking at a map rather than a globe because what Russia has been practicing doing for more than 20 years now is flying around the top of Norway, at which point most of Western Europe is already within range of their long-range missiles. So let's not rule out the possibility that there could be instead a demonstrative action, some form of coercion against a country which is far beyond the frontline states. And if anybody might be interested in how that kind of scenario might play out, I'd really recommend a podcast series that's been put out by Sky News here in the UK called The War Game. It was produced in early June. It's 5 episodes, and it plays out a war game that was carried out with some former senior government and military figures from the UK on the blue side and on the red side. Some of your favorite Russia watching experts who you'll recognize the names if you do listen into this series. It's called The War Game. It's available for free, and I really recommend a listen.
So I wrote a note to myself to definitely listen to it on one of my walks. We have time for a few more questions. I'm going to take a question from the chat. There is a question about Alexander Dugin, the Kremlin's ideologist. I think that's the nickname that he has been provided in the past. And the question is really how much influence does it have today in the last 7 years in shaping, in formatting the ideological thinking and narrative and mindset of the current Russian leadership?
Yes, question from Punch Moulton. And Punch, it's great to see you on the call after however many years it may have been, quite a few, I'm sure. I am one of the people that thinks that the role and importance of Dugin is massively overstated, and in fact, in a way, he's filling a similar role to the role I described Putin in earlier. He's not inventing so much the ideas that he writes about at enormous length in these great geopolitical tracts. Instead, he's tapping into Russian innate assumptions about the nature of the Russian state, Russia's place in the world, and Russia's rights to do whatever it wants to the rest of the world. So not so much inventing these things as just describing the Russian view of how it has the right to conquest, and in fact, in some cases, the duty to reconquer its former colonial possessions around its territory. And in that respect, that's the reason why I think when people have latched on to Dugin as kind of the embodiment of these ideas and looked at Putin doing the same thing, they've joined maybe some dots that weren't actually necessarily there. Certainly, Putin is aware of what Dugin writes, but it won't be the only place that he's aware of it from. So the second part of the question was his influence over the next 7 years. I think let's not think necessarily specifically about Dugin's influence as an individual. What's far more important is the influence of the ideas that he is channeling. And those will continue, as we've known for a very long time. They'll continue to drive Russia to confrontation abroad, to repression at home, unless and until there is a sufficient strategic shock to change Russia's mind.
So we're reaching the end of the webinar, and what we like to do as kind of a final question is to ask the three scenarios. And the three scenarios here are for the conflict itself, and that is question number one: what is the best case scenario for this conflict? In other words, what kind of a resolution can we see and expect, in your opinion, in a best case scenario, or maybe something else that you can define as a best case scenario for the conflict? What would be considered a worst case scenario for this conflict, and what would be considered a black swan or a wild card, so an unpredictable kind of an event or a situation or flow of actions that you would consider to for this conflict. So let's start with the best case scenario.
Yeah, looking at the clock, I can see I'll have to be brief. Sadly, the time when the best case scenario was possible is long past. It would have taken resolute action by Ukraine's Western backers, either immediately after the full-scale invasion or indeed shortly before it, when action was possible, in order to deter Russia from invading or to knock Russia back and cause that defeat at a very early stage. That chance has long gone, and we are left with far worse options. Worst case scenario remains Ukrainian resistance collapsing. It's not impossible that Ukraine might follow the route of countries before it, which have apparently succeeded on the battlefield, but strategically and systemically, they are unable to continue the fight. So they have to surrender or they collapse. The examples that usually come up in that conversation are Finland, 1940 and 1944, Rhodesia in 1979. Everything looks fine, but it falls apart because it's unsustainable. In that situation, Russia rolls forward, Ukraine is subjugated, Ukraine's defense industries, its human capital, its mineral resources all go to feed the Russian war machine for its next efforts and its next advances. Wild Swan, Ukraine once again pulls something out of the hat that nobody was expecting, only this time it has a real political impact within Russia and somehow convinces Moscow that actually it is time to cut their losses and freeze the conflict.
Fantastic. So here at this point, we actually have one more minute. So let me ask you a final question, and that is, from your own internal perspective, you've been following this for a long time. You've been following the Russians' leadership for a long time and their security apparatus. Where this is going in the end, in your opinion? Are we up for a good kind of a good peaceful end to this, or really this is bad, but it's going to get worse, kind of a situation?
There will never be a peaceful end to the existence of Russia on the European conflict until Russia is dealt that strategic defeat, which will cause a realization that the age of empires is over. That is what it takes to remove the one and only hard security threat to Europe.
So those are very strong words. So we're going to conclude the webinar with that, because I think that's a great finale for it. Keir, thank you so much for taking the time, answering the questions, for the insights, for enlightening us about the situation. We've been dealing a lot with the Middle East, obviously, because of the situation that was going on with Iran and Israel and etc. But I think this conflict is ongoing, and even though it's not getting as much media attention, it's definitely one of the most hot spots right now in the world that could escalate very quickly to something much more worse than it is now. So we've been following it. I want to thank all of our guests who joined us to this webinar today for the questions they asked and send us during the chat, using the chat during the webinar and before. I want to thank you also for joining us to our previous webinars, and invite you all to join us in our next webinars that we're going to have this month. Thank you very much, Keir. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.